Chapter 31, Part 1 of Sons of the Covenant by Samuel Gordon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Adrian Praetzellis. Chapter 31, Part 1. It's quite a month since he was here last, and he used to call at least once a week, Mrs. Devine was saying, knitting her brows. I wonder if we have done anything to offend him.
You are an obstinate woman, replied Mr. Alexander rudely. Pray, why shouldn't you take his word? I told you I met him some days ago, and he told me he was extremely busy. You know that he and Phil are going to start the Institute very shortly in temporary premises, and I can well understand that makes heavy claims on his time.
I mentioned the chance of his being offended because you said that, when you taxed him with staying away so long, he appeared awkward and ill at ease, continued Mrs. Devine. Very possibly he was having something at the back of his mind.
So has every hawker, much more so a man who keeps 20 clerks going, interrupted Mr. Alexander dryly. Rose, I wish you wouldn't be so conceited as to think that because a man doesn't overrun you, you have given him a whole bundle of grievances to carry about. You don't understand these things. When a man says he's busy, it doesn't mean he is keeping his nose to the grindstone all day and all night. It means he hasn't an ounce of energy left to take him to or through anything else.
Still, an hour once in a way, persisted Mrs. Devine. Then her voice dropped. Bram, perhaps he does not feel quite in his element here any more.
I don't understand exactly what you mean, Rose.
Well, when a young man has been living for 8 years in a wilderness and comes back to the temptations of a place like London. Mr. Alexander leaned forward and, assuming a mysterious look, whispered to her, You have hit the nail on the head, Rose. He is going to the bad as fast as the devil has time to drive him. Oh, Bram, it isn't really true.
I beg your pardon, my dear. I'm afraid I startled you rather badly, returned Mr. Alexander, laughing penitently. But you know you really deserved some punishment. What made you suggest anything so absurd? You have seen enough of Phil Lipcott to feel sure that he would not go off his balance, whatever the provocation. It distresses me to see you commit such errors of judgment at your time of life.
I am very glad it was an error, said Mrs. Devine, with evident relief. It was because I had got to like him so much that it gave me such a shock. And then I was thinking of his mother. Still, you will perhaps admit that the young men nowadays are not exactly plain sailing. I fancied I had made a pretty close study of Phil, but I wish I knew what construction to put on him of late, she added, suppressing a sigh.
He has been a little mysterious, there's no denying it, said Mr. Alexander very soberly. Of course, he has tried to disguise it as well as he could, but one can't get away from the fact that he has taken to paying us duty calls, Rose. He doesn't seem at home here, or anywhere else for the matter of that. He has the look of a man who finds the world a very narrow place to be in.
I am certain it is Effie, rejoined Mrs. Devine. You remember what I told you about the two some weeks ago?
Well then, why doesn't he run down to Eastbourne to see her, instead of mooning about here in this absurd fashion?
That is what puzzles me so much, Bram. There seemed to be some fanciful arrangement about not making the engagement public for some days, and then came that bank affair which, although I tried hard not to show it, left me for the time being unfit to deal with anything but the most elementary facts of life. It was only after Effie had taken her mother to the seaside that it suddenly came home to me there had been no definite announcement.
I certainly have heard nothing official about it, said Mr. Alexander, shaking his head grimly. But I don't see the point of your standing on ceremony like that. Why don't you ask Phil right out?
The mere fact of my having to ask was proof that he had nothing to tell, or that he did not want to, and to tax him would have embarrassed me much more than him."
"A very sensible explanation," nodded Mr. Alexander. "I wish you would always be so careful about your feelings. Still, that does not help us over the stile. Perhaps, though, there may be a chance of finding out from Effie herself. I understand she will be back tomorrow or the day after."
"I shouldn't like to try it," said Mrs. Devine hastily. "It would be like striking matches to find your way in a powder magazine. The only plan, I am afraid, is to keep quiet and watch developments. But this is very disagreeable all the same."
"Most awkwardly disagreeable," corroborated her brother.
And then he followed Mrs. Devine's example and made a close investigation of the pattern of the carpet. After a full minute's silence he continued, "And now that we have got each other into such a magnificent moping fit, we may as well make the most of our opportunity. Rose, Dulcie is going distinctly off colour." "What, has it struck you too?" came her anxious query.
It appears then that we have each been waiting for the other to mention it," Mr. Alexander replied fiercely. "Rose, we ought to be ashamed of ourselves. No, we oughtn't. It will only waste more time. We must take instant action to make up for our gross and culpable negligence."
"By all means. I shall take her to see Dr. Black tomorrow."
"You will do nothing of the sort. We are not going to frighten her into fancying there's something the matter with her. There isn't, take my word for it, although I haven't a dozen letters after my name. A little change, a little lifting out of the groove is all she wants. And what's more, she's going to have it."
"You mean, Bram?"
"I mean we'll go a-roaming for 6 months or so. You think she will object?"
"I don't know. She won't quite like the idea of leaving her girls' club and the happy evenings so long."
"Won't she?" asked Mr. Alexander, bristling. "We'll see about that. Once we've got her under way, she is at our mercy. You see, I'm not consulting your pleasure in the matter at all, because you will have to come along anyhow. We'll get it over at once. Where is she?"
"Upstairs. I shall send for her," said Mrs. Devine readily.
"I notice she always has to be sent for now," grumbled her brother, continuing in the strain till Dulcie appeared on the scene. It was patent at a glance that the solicitude of the two older people was not altogether without foundation. Dulcie's eyes looked heavy, and the outline of her face showed a distinct approach to angles. Her manner, too, had undergone a change. It had lost its old spontaneous vivacity, and the tutored alertness which had taken its place was a poor substitute. "You wanted me?" she said, her glance roving uncertainly from her mother to her uncle and back again. "Now, please, Uncle Bram, no lectures. You look like it," she added, smiling at him feebly. "Oh dear, no," replied the latter hastily. "It's something else altogether, though your expecting a scolding is strong evidence of a guilty conscience. We only want to ask you to be good enough to pack up your trunks and hold yourself ready for marching orders. You see," he continued, forestalling her inquiry, "I've always understood that there are a few things worth looking at outside this estimable country of ours, and I have at last made up my mind to go and see for myself. Besides, I really want a decent holiday. So does your mother. She has just confessed to me that a recent disagreeable event has had considerably more effect on her nerves than either of us guessed. Of course, you yourself are right as a trivet, but I know you won't be so unkind as to let us two oldsters maunder along deaf and dumb through the continental Babel." "I shall come if you want me to. When do we start?" asked Dulcie. Mr. Alexander collapsed. Under cover of his specious misrepresentations, he was girding up his loins for a tough tussle, but this unlooked-for evaporating of the opposition gave him an unpleasant sensation of being foiled and fooled.
so much so that he nearly betrayed the true state of things, as, ignoring her question, he growled at his niece. "You don't quite seem transported with delight at the idea." "I confess I'm not particularly keen on it at present, but, as they say, the appetite comes in eating," replied Dulcie, with a half-hearted smile. "It will only be the worse for you if it doesn't," said Mr. Alexander formidably. "Well, Rose, when can you be ready? Tomorrow or the day after?" "What are you thinking of, Bram?" remonstrated Mrs. Devine indignantly. "You must give us a week at least." Mr. Alexander chafed at the delay and said so. Mrs. Devine insisted, and the discussion became tolerably animated. But despite appeals from both sides, Dulcie refused to become entangled in the altercation. It was only when she grew conscious how strange her indifference must appear that she interfered at all. "Well, you can tell me afterwards what decision you come to. In any case, I shall only have a few days to arrange for somebody to look after the club, and I must write at once." "Oh, by the way," exclaimed Mrs. Devine as Dulcie was leaving the room, "while you are writing you may as well drop a note to as many of our friends as you can to tell them we are leaving. We shan't have any time for PPC visits. There is one especially I don't want you to forget, Phil's brother." "Your mother has got an idea into her head that we must have somehow given offence to him," explained Mr. Alexander. "Do you happen to be able to account for his long absence?" Dulcie stared at him wide-eyed, as though frightened, then, breathing a "no," went slowly out. Arriving at her room, she told herself that the reason why Uncle Bram's question had taken her aback was because it was the one she had asked herself persistently for the past 3 weeks, and she feared that with those keen, shrewd eyes of his he had read it in her face. That would be indeed terrible. She did not mind wrestling with her perplexity in solitude and silence, but to know somebody at the peephole, though that somebody be her nearest and dearest, would rob her of all her strength, and what would happen then she could not tell, and the mystery of it terrified her. And now, once more, and for the 100th time, why did he not come? For the 100th time also she passed in review the incidents of their last meeting, to see if it contained anything whereat he might reasonably have taken umbrage. And for the 100th time she had to declare herself guiltless. On the contrary, as far as she could remember, it had seemed the beginning of a finer understanding between them, a subtler sympathy, which made itself felt not in what they had said, but in what they had left unsaid. And then this summary, inexplicable halt, just at the moment when a few more steps seemed all that was necessary to... That indeed was the only possible interpretation which had suggested itself to her. He had noticed he was going too far, and he had pulled himself up in time. But the next instant she recoiled at the idea of setting him down for a futile, irresponsible trifler. No, far sooner she would take the blame on herself. It was she who had mistaken the situation and had put the wrong value on his visits. Her overtures it had been which had led to their compact of mutual confidence. He had met her half-considered advances with good-humoured complacence, but had reserved himself the choice of continuing or growing tired as he pleased. Evidently he had chosen the latter, and now she was paying the penalty of her imprudence. It was a heavy penalty. She recollected how she had consulted Effie, whom she had deemed wise in the ways of love. If she had waited but a little longer, there would have been no need for her to seek another's counsel and pay in return an extravagant fee, the confession of her secret. For by now she had acquired very great wisdom of her own, and knew the meaning of the strange antics which her heart was playing. She knew who and what was responsible for her restlessness and discontent, for the loneliness and sense of void which seemed to have become her inalienable portion. A huge gap divided her from the affairs of life, from the things that were most desirable. If she had at all lacked proof, she had received it just now, when she had listened with callous apathy to the offer of gratifying the ardent wish of so many years of seeing with her own eyes the manifold wonders of distant lands. She argued her own utter nervelessness in that she was too unstrung merely to feign the gladness she did not feel. Well, though she could not make of her travels a joy for their own sake, she must see that they should at least not go altogether purposeless. They should be to her the quest after the peace of mind she had lost. They should be a tonic, stringing tight the lax sinews of her soul, so that when she came back she should be ready to take up her life anew, a stronger, more forceful, more valuable life, such as can only be lived by those who have purged themselves of the great besetting weakness, which, more than the sum total of all other flaws, makes humanity the slave and knave of circumstances. She would have preferred not to see Lou again before her departure from London, but for obvious reasons she could not refuse to obey her mother's injunction. And on the other hand, perhaps it was better she should not shun this final trial. It was just as well that she should take accurate measure of the hold he had gained on her, and so impress on herself indelibly the necessity of sterilizing his influence before she would step again into the sphere of its scope. And besides, another pang or two, what did it matter? And she sat down to pen the note with a self-possession which tricked her into an exultant belief that the crisis lay already behind her. But presently she knew better, for she had almost lost count of the number of drafts she had made, before she was satisfied that neither wording nor penmanship gave token that they had cost her a single tremor of heart or hand. And indeed, when the letter reached Lou the next day, he saw in it nothing but a politely worded, neatly written intimation that Mrs. Duveen would be glad if he would take an opportunity within the next few days of coming to wish them Godspeed on their expedition. The writer of the note said nothing as to whether she endorsed the invitation. Though Lou perused it at least a dozen times, there was not a syllable which might even distantly be construed into such an endorsement. Finally, as though to set the seal on his ill success, he called himself a fool for his pains. But he did not get rid of his annoyance with that. It increased as he harked back to his receipt of the missive, and remembered how the first sight of the handwriting on the envelope had sent the blood furiously to his head, only to set him presently shivering as though with ague, and that after weeks, at least so the world reckoned it, of laboriously nursed indifference to everything but the most immediate facts of life, and an over-ears immersion into the whirlpool of the day's bustle and business. Just one little touch, and here he was astir again to the insidious memories to which he was beginning to think himself deaf and blind and blunt. Just one faint echo, and the old undertone of his soul, which he had done his best to tread, frighten, strangle into silence, boomed out again loud in full sonorous responsiveness. He leaned back in his chair, staring before him in sullen helplessness. No doubt he was a clever man of business, but he was a miserable bungler as far as the economy of his heart was concerned. He had made a decided failure of that. All these years he had heaped and hoarded his love, refusing to expend a single grain of it, because he had hoped one day to bestow it where any man might have been proud to bestow it. And now, what was he going to do with it, with the dead weight, the refuse, the unmarketable stock to which it had turned, and which was pressing him to earth. But no, he must not talk like that. It was rank irreverence against the idol he had reared on a pedestal so high that at times he felt doubtful where his earthly creed ended and his divine belief began, and that, being so, it was impossible that his deal should be altogether bad. There must be some virtue in it after all. Probably it required only a little wise manipulation to convert what at first appeared to him an irredeemable loss into a considerable profit. Well, he would try, because a thing was not a vaulting board, he need not make of it a millstone, and the love he bore Dulcie, and always would bear her, was yet to take upon itself its rightful function as the mainspring of his life. He owed it to his self-respect not to be insincere to himself, and yet what had become of his resolution that he would be satisfied with her friendship should other things fail? In the light of his conduct during the past month, it must seem nothing short of a piece of puerile bravado. He knew he could count on her friendship, however much her heart might belong to the someone else. He would recoup himself with that. He would make it a strong factor for good, an impetus to tenser earnestness and greater endeavour. It should become the censor, nay, the guardian of his every word and thought and act. So he would rehabilitate his credit with himself. The letter he had just received had indeed come opportunely. A little later, and it might have found him too perverse to listen to the pleadings of his higher interests. It was in the spirit of recantation that he made his call upon Mrs. Devine that same evening, soon after his office hours, having vainly urged Phil to accompany him. Phil's excuse was a headache. Lou remarked to himself that Phil had of late become strangely subject to headaches. Probably it was the reaction after the hard work he had gone through previous to his examination. As Lou entered the sitting-room, he found there nobody but Mrs. Devine. She rose to meet him, smilingly. "Perhaps you think your prompt response will atone for your long desertion of us," she said. "If you do, you expect from us a simply angelic power of forbearance." He stood looking at her, but not with any uncertainty what to reply. It would be more than despicable to prevaricate to this sweet, frank soul, which seemed to take all men for evangelists, and all life for gospel. "The way you say that is already much more than I could expect," he answered her quietly. "Apologies would be a poor return for it. So, here is the truth. I had a reason for staying away. Some day, though it may be years hence, I shall tell you what it was." "That is charming and honest of you," she rejoined pleasantly, although her face clouded somewhat. "Are you sure, however, that this same reason does not apply still?" "The reason still applies, but it has lost most of its force," was his guarded reply. Then, by tacit consent, the subject was eschewed, and the conversation fell naturally on the contemplated tour abroad. Not very long afterwards Mr. Alexander came in, made a jesting reference or two to Lou's reappearance, and, in accordance with long-standing custom, inquired immediately for Dulcie. Mrs. Devine informed him that Effie had wired that afternoon the time of her arrival, and that Dulcie had gone to the station to meet her. "I expect her in, though, every moment. I suppose she is helping Effie to unpack. You see, she has put Effie under an obligation. We shall want plenty of help next week," added Mrs. Devine with a smile at Lou, which the latter returned, but not over-successfully. "By the way, I hope she will persuade the two of them to come round here for dinner." A quarter of an hour later Mrs. Devine's hope was gratified by the appearance of Dulcie, accompanied by Mrs. Elkin and Effie. There were effusive greetings between the older people, in the midst of which Dulcie came up to Lou and proffered her hand. Nothing but a commonplace salutation passed between them. She gave no spoken hint that his presence was anything out of the ordinary course of events, or that it called for any special comment. But had Lou not been occupied too greatly with his own feelings, he could not have helped noticing that, on the face of it, there was something studied in this indifference, and that, at the very least, it could be construed into pique. As it was, his thoughts chiefly concentrated themselves on wondering whether an African tan of 8 years' standing was strong enough to mask his sudden ebb of colour. Mr. Alexander's importune call to table rescued them from what threatened to be an awkward silence. Lou saw nothing strange in it that Dulcie should forestall a reoccurrence of the predicament by giving him Mrs. Elkins for a neighbour. Why, indeed, should she discomfort herself by directing her words to him, when doubtless her thoughts were far and distant with that mysterious someone else? He harped almost vindictively on the phrase, forgetting that it was one of his own coining. However, the conversation over dinner showed no trace of the emotional cross-currents agitating at least two of the components of the little gathering. For one thing, there was no lack of material. Effie was fluent and amusing enough in her account of their Eastbourne experiences. She seemed to have recovered her usual high spirits, discounting the impression only by an occasional hardness around the mouth, which found its counterpart in some harsh and bitter speech. Mr. Alexander was full of the projected tour, and entered with great gusto into the details of his arrangements, in the forethought and thoroughness of which he evinced evident self-satisfaction. And Lou, instead of feeling, as he had fully expected, that he was passing through an ordeal, found himself pleasantly taking an intelligent interest in the proceedings, and evidently even followed them with a sort of wary enjoyment. It was only when his eyes lighted on Dulcie that the graver issues of the occasion came upon him, and made him wince at the prospect of bleak, dreary days still to be battled through. He had so far not made up his mind whether he should ask Dulcie in so many words for what he required of her, or whether he should allow her to guess from the mere fact of his presence that he was bent on resuming their old amicable relations. He preferred the latter. The former alternative was so much more difficult. He might submit his request clumsily, and would let her see that he knew more about the affairs of her inmost heart than he had a right to know, and by making her angry he might foil his own ends. Still, he would see how events shaped. The evening was young yet. End of Chapter 31, Part 1. Chapter 31, Part 2, the last chapter of Sons of the Covenant by Samuel Gordon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Adrian Praetzellis. Chapter 31, Part 2. Dinner had come to a close, but Mr. Alexander was still in full swing, and being loath to interrupt himself, he asked and obtained leave for himself and Lou to smoke their cigars in the dining-room. Effie's attention, however, seemed to have become exhausted, for a minute or two later she slipped away over to the window, drew back the hangings, and gazed out. "Dulcie, come here and look," she called presently. Dulcie obeyed readily, and almost simultaneously Lou gave way to the impulse which lifted him up, and followed her. "May I look too?" he asked with jesting humility. The two girls silently made room for him in the window niche. It was indeed a sight to hold the eye and the tongue captive. The grand, spacious garden lay bathed in moonlight down to its uttermost verge. Its trees and hedgerows stood out delicately against a background of silver. They had doffed the air of stubborn sullenness they had worn all the winter, and now seemed softening back into the joy of life at the first presage of the spring. Over it all hung a gracious stillness, a penetrating peace, which was as a message of goodwill and reconciliation to Mother Earth, and to all the multitudinous progeny that was hers. Dulcie was the first to speak, but she did it in a whisper. "Oh, I can't stand here just looking at it. I must feel it. Come, Effie." "I should like to, but remember, I have had 4 hours of train today." Then, with a quick afterthought, "Perhaps you, Mr. Lipcott?" "I was just about to offer myself," interposed Lou, trying to hide his eagerness beneath a tone of measured courtesy. Dulcie answered him with a swift look of distrust. "But only on condition you make yourself thoroughly airtight," he went on with a smile. "You see, I shall be responsible for you to your mother." Mrs. Devine readily gave her assent, only adding her own admonition to Lou's, and the two went out into the hall, where Dulcie wrapped herself up securely, and from there into the open. They were nearly halfway down the sidewalk before either spoke. "There is no danger of our damaging the chrysanthemums tonight," said Lou, half aloud. "What? Do you remember that?" she asked in pleased surprise. "Certainly. Why shouldn't I?" "It's such a little thing, and so long ago," she explained, not without some confusion. "Yes, very long ago," he confirmed pensively. "Would you like to change back?" she asked more lightly. "It would be no use to me. I think I was as old then as I am now." "You ought to be glad that you can say that. If 8 years made no difference to you, it means you will never be really old." "It might mean that I was never really young," was his retort. "Yes, probably your construction is the right one. At least you ought to know best. And to tell the truth, you always did give me the impression that you were born with your world ready-made. You seem to have accepted the people and things that entered into it afterwards with a sort of silent protest." His breath came short at the unconscious irony of her words. His world complete and fulfilled? His world was a void, a chaos, into which he was dying to drag her with paeans of thanksgiving, for without her it would never know the blessings of light and order. And he dared not even tell her so. "Do you think it worth your while to make such a close study of me?" he asked, turning on her suddenly. "But I didn't make a study of you. I wasn't so presumptuous. What I said just now I must have learned by a flash of inspiration. Now, please, it's your turn." "My turn? For what?" "For saying something nice to me. I made out that you were an unfathomable mystery. Everybody likes to be told that. So you owe me a compliment in return. Do let us keep up the game." He paused. Neither the manner nor the matter of her remark struck him pleasurably. It was more than mere flippancy. It was, as far as he had cognizance of these things, a distinct attempt at coquetry. At first he only thought how inconsistent with her true self that was, but then it came home to him that, knowing what he knew, he ought to construe it into a direct offence against himself. Perhaps she was only practising on him for the benefit of the someone else, and his displeased surprise veered round to downright irritation. "Well, haven't you thought of anything to say yet?" she prompted him with a laugh. "I don't think the game is worthy of you," he replied brusquely. "Why, now you've said it without wanting to," she pointed out to him, essaying to repeat her laugh, but getting no further than a faint echo of it. "However, I will take your hint." Her ready deference to his mood made him instantly repentant. "I suppose you are looking forward to your tour with great pleasure," he said very gently. "It must be very pleasant to see new sights. You probably can speak to that from your own experience," was the evasive reply. "And you, of course, will have the additional advantage of taking your family circle along with you, so you will have no occasion for homesickness," he went on rapidly. "By the way, will there be anybody besides the three of you?" "No, I thought you understood that," she replied, and not without some surprise. "I mean, perhaps somebody is coming to join you later on the road." Her surprise grew. "I don't know who would take the trouble." "Why, what makes you think that?" "I really don't know," he answered in confusion. "I had an idea that you might have made some such arrangement, especially as I gathered that your tour might be a rather extended one." He walked on a little faster, as though to get away from the sensation of shame which had come upon him suddenly. He felt like a man who has narrowly escaped being detected in some shabby device. Ever since he had been led to assume that she was lost to him, he had not been sensible of any curiosity as to whose great fortune it had been to have found her. Once or twice he had, in an idle sort of wonder, gone through the list of the men whom he had met at the house. He had to admit that there was not a single one to whom Dulcie's bearing, and he had watched her very closely, had been anything more than either coldly courteous or good-naturedly tolerant. Perhaps he had missed him on his visits. Perhaps it was somebody out of town. He had frequently heard names mentioned in terms that denoted long-standing acquaintance, names which to him, however, were nothing but names. They had concerned him but little till just before, when jealous impulse seized him mightily, if momentarily, and drove him, as it were, into laying a snare for her. He was thankful he had failed. The failure was the only thing to redeem him. "This is the spot," he heard her say in the next instant. He caught her meaning in a flash. "Where we became castaways and had to wait for relief," he supplemented quite soberly. "In a way it ought to be historic," she said with a laugh of embarrassment. This time he did not follow her so readily. "Do you mean because the extract from ancient history Phil treated us to at the time?" Her mirth became more genuine. "I never gave a thought to that. No." Her voice hung with grave and sustained emphasis on the monosyllable. "Was it not here that we vowed eternal friendship?" He turned to her with eager scrutiny. What? More flippancy? More? But no. She was serious. Quite serious. He could be absolutely certain of it. The moonlight told him no untruth. "Yes, we did. We did," was his quick reply. "And how, it will seem a strange question to you, how do you think we kept our vow?" "I shall only speak for myself. I know I always have kept it, and come what may, always shall keep it." He felt cowed, and yet exhilarated at the coincidence which played so strangely into his hands. But she shook her head slowly. "No, I can't agree with you, as to the past at any rate," came from her deliberately. "Do you know, Mr. Lipcott, I have a good right to be angry with you." "Angry with me?" he repeated. "Yes," she said. "During the first few weeks after your return, at the time when we really came into each other's cognizance, you led me to believe that you considered my help, however indirect, would be of some avail to you, and then, after buoying me up with the hope, after fanning my aspirations into flame, you changed your mind. You think that was fair?" He understood her at once, but surprise kept him silent. "I felt the humiliation of it deeply," she went on, more animated. "The only conclusion I could draw was that you did not think me fit to be anything more than an intelligent listener to the planning of the work, who, when it got beyond that, was to be set aside as a mere encumbrance. If at least you had told me so frankly, it would have been less galling than to be left to find it out for myself by being so completely ignored. I am aware, from purely outside sources, that your scheme will come into operation very shortly. I know you have acquired the temporary premises in which your institute is to make its bow to the world, and that you have nearly completed all your final arrangements. But of the inner workings, I know nothing. I tried to probe Phil whenever I had the occasion. His answers were mere makeshifts. The upshot of them was a kind of, "Don't bother, everything will be all right," and that when I thought myself entitled from your assurances to be allowed behind the scenes, to be allowed to watch. But there, what does it matter? Please say you don't think my remonstrances unreasonable. Try and make allowances for me. People like you, whose lives, day in, day out, are nothing but action, and again action, can hardly understand the, what shall I call it, the work-hunger of those condemned to comparative dronehood. He was still wrestling with his thoughts, his words, and before he quite knew he had mastered either, he answered, "Yes, you ought to be angry. I broke my word. And what is more, I did it consciously. I knew it all the time. What I did not know, what I never came near to dreaming, was that you should lay it to heart 100th part as much as you seem to have done. But I shall also tell you this, that you did not lose by it 100th part of what I did. Beyond that, I can give you no explanation." "I don't require any, not in the least," she broke in hastily. "I shall be content if, having acknowledged your breach of faith, you do your best to redeem it. I do so much want to have my share in the work. I'm afraid that if I don't take my place before the start, others will step in, and there will be no room for me. That is, I admit it frankly, what robs our intended tour of half its pleasure for me. And then there is another point. It may strike you as a piece of feminine vanity. You made me rise ever so high in my own estimation when you told me what good you thought it possible for me to achieve. I don't want to think that you had gone back on that opinion. I want to rehabilitate myself, and the only way you can do that is to give me your promise of the place you once said I could fill." "Then you really care what I think of you?" he asked eagerly. "Will you promise?" was the counter-question that glanced off his own. "Yes," he replied, manifestly disappointed. "But don't flatter yourself that I shall take your mere word for it, especially as you are making the promise under pressure," she continued, almost gaily. "This spot," they were still standing among the chrysanthemums, "is propitious for making compacts. At least we have already made one here. Let us make our second here as well. Don't be afraid. I'm not going to extract from you a heavy guarantee. Only this." Smiling, she held out her hand to him. He took it and held it, second after second, as though he had absolutely forgotten to let it go. She did not remind him. So they stood, looking at each other without a word. A few minutes ago the distance of space between them had been as miles, and now it was dwindling down to its proper span, a span of inches. All at once the grip of his fingers tightened frantically on hers. The inches lessened, and presently they were close together, each feeling the magnetic current from the other's heart, and gathering into themselves with tingling gladness the mutual message it conveyed to them. That was all. The fence and foil of circumstance, the parry of cross-purposes that had used them so cruelly, it all availed nothing. Phil's kismet was brilliantly vindicated. It had been destined, and they had found each other. The chrysanthemums nodded very wisely as their whisper went round among them.
We knew it all along, ever since that time 8 years ago. I've had so many things to say, so much to ask, so much to wonder at," he breathed into her ear. "So have I," she replied, with something like a sob. "But not now. We have plenty of time before us." "Plenty of time?" he repeated exultantly. "Of course we have. My life is only just beginning." "And so is mine," she added. "But still we must not forget about all the other people we knew before we lived." "Yes, the other people. Come, we'll go and tell them." And so they went, still holding each other by the hand, along the garden walk, up the terrace steps, through the hall, into the room, all the way hand in hand, like two playmate children who after their little quarrel have once more returned to good accord. Mrs. Devine and Mrs. Elkin were sitting at a game of cribbage, with Mr. Alexander close by, giving both impartial advice. But not being so engrossed as the players, he was the first to look up as the two entered. His look grew to a stare. "What on earth have you young ones been up to?" he cried. "Look, Rose!" But Mrs. Devine was too late, for the next instant Dulcie, having wound herself loose, was hiding her face in her mother's shoulder. Lou followed more leisurely, trying to bear his happiness meekly. "You wanted to know why I stayed away so long?" he said, catching Mrs. Devine's eagerly questioning eyes. "Here is the reason. It's just kissing you. May I have it for good, Mother?" "I'm so glad, was the shape her consent took, while Mr. Alexander, with greater control of his speech, blessed himself and "well, I never," as he had never done in his life. "Where is Effie?" asked Dulcie, lifting her head suddenly to look around. "I thought she went out to join you in the garden," said Mrs. Elkin. "I must go and find her," said Dulcie, asking Lou's permission with a glance. "She will never forgive me if I don't." And with that she was out in the hall, speeding up the stairs to her own room. As she stepped in, Effie came towards her and kissed her with quiet lovingness, as she said, "I hope you will be very happy, Dulce dear." "How do you know?" gasped the latter. "Don't think I was spying. I couldn't stand the talk downstairs. It made my head burst, and I should break your piano if I sat down to it, so I came up here and happened to look through the window at the wrong time." "Well, Effie, are we going to be sisters-in-law?" queried Dulcie finally. "No, dear, that is all done with," answered Effie, setting her lips tightly. "But why? Why?" insisted Dulcie miserably. "How much longer is this wretched misunderstanding between you to last? Effie, you just said you hoped I would be happy. How can you expect me to be when you put me on the rack like this?" "You are quite right," said Effie pensively. "I dare not refuse you anything tonight. I shall tell you what there is to tell, and it won't make you any happier. At any rate, I shall not have to grope in the dark any longer, and that will be something." "You are wrong about the misunderstanding," said Effie resolutely. "There is none, absolutely none. Both he and I know exactly what drove us apart. We thought and fought it out on a fair field. There was his parliamentary career. He knew how I'd set my heart on it. He gave it up, presumably to have his hands free for that old idiosyncrasy of his, the scheme. I gave him his choice, and like a sensible man, he took it. That is all." "Of course he gave you his reasons," said Dulcie quickly. Effie shrugged her shoulders. "He wanted to. I would not listen." "Would not listen? Why not? That is the least he could claim." "It seemed to me impossible that he could have any strong enough, and then I was afraid he would talk me over with plausibilities.
which would convince me on the surface and yet leave the sting of my final dissatisfaction deep down in my heart." "In that case you were certainly wise," said Dulcie speciously. "But still I thought as a mere matter of curiosity—" "I would have given half my life to know," interrupted Effie. "Shall I tell you?" "How can you know?" asked Effie, with the very faintest tinge of scorn. "I know because I know Phil," said Dulcie, undaunted. "You will remember how the old song puts it: 'I could not love thee, dear, so much loved I not honour more.' That will give you the keynote to his conduct. When it came to a tug-of-war between conscience and love, conscience pulled stronger, but the victory was really with love." "Yes, quite so," came bitterly from Effie. "There you have it. Honour, conscience, and all the paraphernalia of the sophist." Dulcie smiled patiently. "Tell me, Effie, would you have been content to know that things went on smoothly between you only because Phil did not have the courage to acknowledge himself a renegade? Would it not have made you feel like an accomplice?" "Renegade? That's a very strong word." "It's the word he used himself. Could you suggest any other? He had taken on himself a sacred obligation. You may dub it an idiosyncrasy, but you must admit he has a right to his own view, and you should not have stood in his way when the call came to him to redeem himself. I can understand your setting him the choice of a test, and then feeling glad and proud that his decision went against you. Doesn't it strike you that he has done what not one man in 1,000 would do?" "Yes, but I can put several constructions on that," returned Effie gloomily. "Put on the best, then," begged Dulcie. "Believe that what he did was the best for the two of you. He went back to this first duty of his with his eyes wide open. He would not put on you the indignity of becoming wife to a man who had turned his back on the great principle of his life. And as for himself, well, how could he do justice to your love with his self-reproach continually taunting him into secret discontent? Effie, you must give in." "If there is to be any giving in, why must it come from me?" cried Effie, with a last effort of rebelling. "So as to convince yourself that he is stronger than you," replied Dulcie firmly. "Effie, there are millions of women in the world who would bless their fate for the privilege of being able to yield, for knowing that the man they are coupled to is not a reed nor a weakling, that he has strength enough and wisdom enough for the two of them, so they can merge their destiny blindly, confident in his. Effie, you would lose half your faith in him if you found it was he who had bridged the gulf instead of you." Effie looked at her with a glance which Dulcie felt going through and through. Then Effie said slowly, "Dulcie, I can only say this: you are a wonder. How you can argue like that when all the time your heart is soaring sky high is unearthly. But for all that, don't flatter yourself. It is not your arguments that tell with me. It is yourself. It is the knowledge of your happiness, and the knowledge that I could be as happy if I liked." "If you can be, then it is a sin that you are not," replied Dulcie with glowing cheeks. "If you can be, I tell you, throw everything else to the wind. Your doubts, your pride, your chances of the fame you aspire to. The exchange is worth it." "You dear passionate little silly," cried Effie, catching her in her arms. "Do you think you are telling me news? Why, I knew all that. I had tasted it, digested it, long before you had an inkling you would ever do likewise. But I am grateful to you for all that. I wanted someone to make me the pace. I should have died of chagrin and jealousy to see you so happy, while I—" Gently she pushed Dulcie from her, and commenced to fumble in the folds of her dress, producing from there presently a neat little paper scroll. She unrolled it hastily, and without another glance at it, deliberately tore it through the middle. "Oh, what's that?" cried Dulcie, a little frightened. Only my agreement with the agent. I had to carry it about with me while we were away. Phil will know what I mean when he sees it like this. Quick, an envelope. I'm not going to waste another minute." "Don't you think you might write him just a word besides?" asked Dulcie, as she saw Effie proceeding to fasten it up. Effie looked at her dubiously. "Ought I?" she reflected aloud. "Well, I suppose I'd better. You have been engineering this business right through, so I must follow your advice." She sat down and scribbled a few words. "Stamp?" asked Dulcie. "No, I don't think I shall want one," replied Effie, putting the missive into her pocket. "And now, please come down. There's no more mischief left for you to do up here." 2 or 3 friends had dropped in during their absence, and Dulcie became very busy gathering in her harvest of congratulations. Lou stood close by her side, a smiling Cerberus. However, he did not stay very late. "I want to go and tell Mother," he whispered to her. "And I want to go and make certain it isn't a dream," she whispered back. "But tomorrow, very early," he affirmed solemnly. They were standing in the hall when Effie came gliding up to them. "I beg pardon for interrupting," she said meekly, "but will you see your brother yet tonight?" "Yes, I intend to drop in on him for a moment," said Lou. "Then do you mind giving him this?" she continued, handing him the envelope. "You must not forget, it is very particular." "Yes, very particular," testified Dulcie, and then, on Effie's withdrawal, her lips shyly, but without shrinking, testified to something else. Lou stepped out into the night, which to him was transfigured into a glamour and radiance incomparable to the brightest sunrise he had ever known. He hailed an opportunely passing cab with a shout that gave the driver some trouble in bringing his horse to a standstill, and arrived at Rupert Street before he had felt the motion of the wheels. The streak of light through the chinks of the shutter told him that Phil was in. He knocked and entered. Phil rose from the perusing of the ponderous law volume before him, and faced his brother with a look of half-hearted inquiry. His face showed pitiably drawn and haggard beneath the lamplight. "What is it, Lou?" he asked, with some little show of interest. "You haven't come here for nothing." "No, I haven't," acquiesced Lou, successfully keeping his features under control. "I came to tell you of an important discovery I made tonight. Phil, I love Dulcie." "Well?" asked Phil, this time with genuine eagerness. "A month ago you told me there was someone else." "That need not prevent your trying." "What is the use when she has made her choice of the other man?" "Who said so?" cried Phil vehemently. "You did." Phil's lips moved, and when he eventually spoke it was clear his words were other than those dictated by his first impulse. "Lou, I implore you, try." Lou shook his head with a pretence of despairing obstinacy. "By the way, I am to give you this," he said. Phil took the little packet, which bore no superscription, with nonchalant indifference. He opened it negligently, drew out the torn agreement, and looked at it, dazed and vacantly. Again and again he looked, and still did not understand. So Dulcie's suggestion was a happy one after all. It saved him quite a minute of doubt, such a minute as might have made a difference to any man's sanity. But the accompanying message said clearly enough, "I prefer breaking this to breaking my heart. Come." But despite the sudden impact of gladdening certainty, which almost made more havoc of him than his previous bewilderment, his first thought was for his brother. His half-share in Dulcie's secret had come back to him just when the need for it was most imminent, and of course he could do with it what he liked. "Lou, the someone else is yourself, I swear it," he cried exultantly. Lou gripped the outstretched hand in both of his as he replied, mischief and triumph blending in his voice. Phil, aren't you ashamed to let yourself get hoaxed like this? Didn't you see I knew? Forgive the little joke. Forgive? I will do more than that. I will laugh with you. Well, what are we waiting for? Let's go take Mother the finest present she ever had. 2 daughters at one time. Lou, isn't this the best of all possible worlds? It stands to reason that the projected journey abroad was unceremoniously hustled out of its place in the catalogue of immediate events. Neither Mrs. Devine nor Mr. Alexander was particularly grieved at not having to exchange the secure comforts of their home life for the doubtful amenities of continental wear and tear. Besides, their main object had been already brilliantly achieved, a thing which Dulcie lost no time to make plain to them. The topic which occupied the most attention was the forthcoming semi-formal opening of the provisional premises of the Institute. Lou and Phil had decided to make it an almost private function, so as to prevent anything in the nature of an anticlimax when the permanent foundation would come to be inaugurated. The scheme had already secured a number of influential well-wishers, and its propaganda promised hopefully for the future. It was on the day appointed for the opening that Lou called for Dulcie at an early hour in the forenoon. "I want you to come and be introduced to a very great friend of mine, dearest," he said. "With pleasure. But don't you think it a rather unorthodox time for paying a visit?" she asked. "No. Oh, he won't mind. He is at home any hour of the day," smiled Lou. "We must go by train. He lives some little way out into the country," he informed her as she stepped out. An hour later they got out at the suburban station, and presently had left behind them the last of the small cluster of private residences adjoining it. "We are nearly there, dear," said Lou reassuringly. Dulcie looked about her in wonder. "Why, I don't see any houses, and here is a cemetery." "That is where my friend lives," said Lou solemnly. She clutched him by the arm eagerly. "Oh, I know whom you mean, dear. The old man I have once or twice heard vaguely mentioned, the one who loved you so much and was so good to you." "The same," affirmed Lou gravely, "and he was good to me. Without him, perhaps, there would have been no success in life for me, no scheme, no Dulcie." "Don't say that," she pleaded, clinging to him more closely. "It makes me tremble to think that it was all an accident. It wasn't, Lou. Give him all the credit that it is due, but I am certain that even if the opportunity had not been thrust on you, as it were, you would somehow have managed to snatch it for yourself, and everything would have been just as it is." "I see you want to keep your good opinion of me and not have my genius belittled," jested Lou, smiling at her tenderly. "Well, I'm willing to make a compromise. Let us put it down to capacity judiciously tempered with luck. I don't think any man, whether of our race or any other, who has made some headway will pretend to anything more. And I certainly see no reason to doubt the luck," he added, the tenderness of his smile deepening as he looked at her. They had reached the grave, detached from the rest by the foot-high parapet of rail surrounding it. There was a trim, neat look about it, which told Lou that the groundkeeper had conscientiously earned the yearly stipend he had allowed him. On the headstone gleamed the inscription, "Christopher Donaldson, unforgettable," as fresh and bright as if it had been lettered there but yesterday. Slowly and reverently Dulcie placed the bunch of daffodils she carried on the grave. "How glad he must feel that he is not forgotten," she whispered. Lou said nothing, but as he took her hand, the thoughts which had stirred him so mightily at Christopher's funeral service came back to him with the full volume and weight of their inner truth. Who knew
but that their presence at this lonely grave had brought nearer, by one infinitesimal step, the grace and good accord between man and man which would rival the imperishable mercy vouchsafed by heaven to earth ever since the time of the very oldest of God's covenants. The End. End of chapter 31, and end of Sons of the Covenant, A Tale of London Jewry by Samuel Gordon. Recorded by Adrian Praetzellis in Santa Rosa, California, December 2017.